Picking up at number 5, Mrs. Carmody, The Mist, who falls within the realm of some of King's most terrifying non-supernatural characters, although she didn't quite nip the top spot in that one.
They, people who refuse to bend to the will of God and claim it privilege. Sinners and pride.
Although you could argue that Mrs. Carmody has a slight supernatural slant to her. In the novella, she is alluded to be practicing witchcraft and thus having enacted a pact with the big bad baddie himself, Randall Flagg, he who walks behind the roads, whatever you want to call him. Nevertheless though, the thing that makes Mrs. Carmody so damn terrifying is her religious fanaticism, which is squashed down, condensed and trapped inside a pressure boiler throughout the plot of The Mist. She is terrifying simply because of what she represents and the lengths that she's willing to go to brainwash people into thinking that she's a prophet of God. All while there's a terrifying tentacle mist threatening the lives of the poor people of Bridgeton, Maine. Yeah, talk about opportunity knocks, right? Much like Margaret White, the mother of Carrie, Mrs. Carmody embodies the zealotry that King is so critical of throughout his work, and the result is one of the most terrifying human characters in his fiction. You know why? Because you just can't reason with her. Coming in next at number 4, Blaine the Mono, The Dark Tower, The Wastelands, who really, when you look at it, is perhaps one of the most unique monsters in the whole of horror fiction. A train. And how did King manage to make a train scary? He decided to give it an intelligent artificial mind that was on the constant brink of a mental breakdown. For those of you that haven't read Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, you really should, because it's exactly the stuff like this that makes it one of the most unique blends of fantasy and horror that I've ever read, all while being genuinely fear-inducing throughout and King's crowning glory in his fiction. Roland Deschain is one of my favourite characters in literature, and we're going to talk about him a lot in this list. But first we have to talk about Blaine the Mono, a sentient monorail train that went insane. In The Dark Tower, for the quartet, a group of individuals bound together by cosmic destiny, Blaine was the only way for them to get out of the wastelands from Lud to Topeka, but the insane train was hell-bent on wrapping them up in his own personal suicide. The only solution was to humour Blaine in a game of riddles, which makes for some of the most intense, nerve-wracking scenes in horror fiction. Being trapped on a runaway train is scary enough, but when that train is a highly powerful, fragmented, mentally unstable machine child, the stakes are a little bit higher, to say the least. Next up at number 3, Annie Wilkes, Misery.
There! Look there! See what you made me do? Oh, Paul, I'm sorry.
Perhaps the most terrifying non-supernatural Stephen King villain going. Actually, scratch that, she definitely is. What makes Annie Wilkes so terrifying is her element of humanity, or the lack of thereof. She's made up of flesh and bones, no magic seal that binds her life force for infinity, yet she's equally as unstoppable and horrifyingly relentless as King's greatest horror villains. As the seminal villain of King's 1987 novel Misery, she finds herself miraculously caring for her all-time favourite novelist Paul Sheldon, after he suffers a near-fatal car accident during a snowstorm. Turns out, the kindly nurse is actually a rage-filled, blood-boiling psychopath responsible for the murders of nearly 70 people throughout her life. Also, she's got a pig who she named Misery after her favourite fictional character, Misery Chastain, who Paul plans to kill off in his latest novel, and that makes her really mad. You'll know the scene when you see it, but the 1990 version of Misery features one of the most bone-crunching, stomach-churning scenes in cinematic history, played out by the show-stopping Kathy Bates, who manages to perfectly portray the true insanity of King's Annie Wilkes. Swinging in next at number 2, Pennywise the Clown, It. We all float down here. Perhaps the reason that when I first accidentally caught a glimpse of the 1990 miniseries when my parents were watching it, that I was terrified to take a shower or stand near a drain for weeks. And the reason why I'm still terrified of clowns, and the reason why reading the novel years later was still a nightmare-inducing experience. It is traumatic in the truest sense of the word. Pennywise the Dancing Clown, Robert Gray, the Eater of Worlds, the Deadlights, whatever you want to call it, this creation is undisputedly one of the true nightmares of Stephen King's work. Its sole motivation is to eat and sleep. Eat people specifically, and then sleep for 27 to 30 years. But for me, it's in the origin of evil that Pennywise the Clown truly shines. As the novel loosely touches on, as well as the wider King shared universe, it originated in an undiscovered void containing and surrounding our universe, which is often referred to as the macroverse, a concept related to Todash darkness, a dimension of nothingness. King takes a concept which is Lovecraftian in its scope and then hurls it down to a human level, makes it slink away into the sewers and take the form of a clown who offers children a red balloon on rainy days in Derry, Maine. And it's terrifying. Truly terrifying. And finally, our number one spot, Randall Flagg, the Dark Tower, the Stand.
You're the one that called me here. Not by the telephone, but with your every desire to get rid of the brat, all in the hope that mommy there might love you best.
And I hate to put a clip of the 2017 release of The Dark Tower because it was such a disappointment that I don't even want to talk about it, but Matthew McConaughey was actually really decent as the Man in Black, so he stays. King himself claimed that Randall Flagg was the greatest villain that he'd ever penned and serves as the overarching evil in the King mythos, making appearances in a multitude of novels including The Dark Tower, The Stand, Eyes of the Dragon, Heart of Atlantis, Children of the Corn, Gwendy's Button Box, and he has many names: the Man in Black, Walter O'Dim, Old Creeping Judas. He's an immortal sorcerer who has schemed his way across the ages, forcing humanity to enact vile atrocities in his name, all because, essentially, he's bored. But in King's world, there is one man who can stop him: Roland Deschain of Gilead. For me, one of the greatest lines ever penned in literature is the Man in Black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed, because a villain is nothing without a hero to combat him.
In at 5, Annie Wilkes from Misery.
This isn't what happened last week. Have you all got amnesia? They just cheated us. This isn't fair. He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car.
Annie Marie Wilkes Dugan is the main antagonist in the 1987 novel Misery, and perhaps one of the scariest characters to ever be created by Stephen King. In the 1990 film adaptation, Annie Wilkes was portrayed by Kathy Bates, a performance that garnered her an Academy Award win. Now, as we know, a whole lot of people want to be famous, or to at least be able to experience it for a short amount of time. I mean, the idea of having strangers recognize you, admire you, and want to take pictures with you can be incredibly appealing for some folks out there. However, to those people I say, have you ever seen or read Misery? I'm guessing not. On the surface, Annie Wilkes is caring, passionate, and the next door neighbor that would likely bake you cookies when you're having a bad day. However, we quickly learn this is not the case when our favorite author Paul Sheldon crashes his car and winds up in the home of Annie Wilkes. Wilkes becomes furious when she learns that Sheldon has killed off Misery, her favorite character in her favorite novel. So what does she do? She turns into a fairy godmother possessed by a demon, restrains him in her home, and breaks his ankles with a sledgehammer. It's brutal. She is perhaps one of the most cunning and devious characters in not just a Stephen King novel, but in all of literature. And what makes her truly terrifying is that she could be real. She is not Pennywise, a shape-shifting entity lurking in the sewers. Annie could be anyone. She could be your next door neighbor or even a distant relative, and that's what is so terrifying. Who knows what people are hiding behind a cheery facade? Maybe a sledgehammer. Coming in at 4, Margaret White from Carrie.
And then the girls, they all laughed at me and threw things at me.
And Eve was weak. Say it.
No, Mama.
Eve was weak.
No.
Eve was weak.
No.
Eve was weak. Say it.
No, Mama.
Now, for some who don't quite understand the abusive undertones, well, overtones in my opinion, Carrie would seemingly look like the villain in the novel and 1976 film of the same name. I mean, she's a telekinetic girl who kills everyone at the high school prom. That's pretty damn evil, right? Wrong. Carrie is no villain, she is the victim. Aside from the bullies at Carrie's high school who pour pig's blood on her and pelt her with sanitary pads, her mother Margaret White is the true villain of the story. She evidently has some serious mental health issues and has devoted her life to being a Christian who believes everything is a sin, even sexual intercourse, including within marriage. Now, Margaret does have love for Carrie, but that love becomes warped due to her bizarre perspective on reality, which oftentimes results in wild fits, rants, and tantrums, particularly during times when she catches Carrie doing something that she deems sinful, which is essentially anything that isn't to do with the Bible. Carrie's punishment is reading passages from the Bible or being beaten with the Bible. Margaret even sometimes locks her inside of a small closet filled with religious icons so she can pray for forgiveness. Quite literally, from the time Carrie was born, Margaret has made her life a living hell, while making Carrie believe that she is unfit for the world she's living in, making her an easy target for bullies. Margaret, upon discovering Carrie's telekinetic powers, considered her to be a Satanist, and brutally punishes her. Now, like our previous number, what makes Margaret so damn terrifying is that she's simply a middle-aged woman in Maine, meaning that a monster could literally be hiding behind any door. Coming in at 3, Mrs. Massey from The Shining. Lorraine Massey is an eternal guest at the Overlook Hotel, and is perhaps the most recognizable spirit in the film adaptation of The Shining. She is the ghost that resides in room 217 or 237 depending on which medium you're meeting her through. On first appearance she is beautiful, but quickly reveals herself to be a vile, decomposing creature who has nothing but bad intentions for the poor soul who enters her room. For context, Lorraine was known to seduce young bellboys into her room where they would engage in sexual acts. However, one day when she was full of self-disgust, she committed suicide by cutting her wrists in the bath. Now, why she has so much hatred towards guests is beyond me, but what is made clear to us is that she wants to bring pain and misery upon all visitors to her suite. Stephen King has created some truly vile and terrifying monsters in literature, but Mrs. Massey is by far one of the scariest, simply because she is a mouldy, naked corpse who refuses to stop haunting you, even if you're a 5-year-old boy. No one is safe. Coming in at number 2, Randall Flagg from the Dark Tower series. Randall Flagg is so terrifying. He has appeared in 7 novels by Stephen King, with his first appearance coming to us in The Stand as a demonic figure who wreaks havoc after a plague kills most of the population. Now, his character backstory is incredibly dark, with Randall being given to a mill owner and his wife to be brought up to learn the ways of men. At the age of 13, he grew bored and burned down his home before being raped by a wanderer. However, instead of returning home, he sought to fulfill his destiny instead. He learned the ways of dark magic and became an incredibly powerful sorcerer, and to some extent a demon with quasi-immortality. Randall's goals typically center on bringing down civilizations, usually through spreading destruction and sowing conflict. He brings pain, he brings death, he even brings mutilation. Like our number 1, he is evil incarnate, with no goal other than evil itself. Now, what makes this dude terrifying is that he's resilient. Once he gets a goal, he sticks with it, thus lingering around for 7 books. That's quite an accomplishment. Plus, on top of that, he frequently aligns himself with our number 1, and anyone who attempts to take him down usually ends up wishing they had died on the journey to him. And finally, coming in at number 1, the Crimson King from the Dark Tower series. I mean, the Crimson King is literally the Eater of Worlds. Of course he's going to nab our number 1 spot on this list, although I will say it was very, very close. He's a monster who is as close to the collective depiction of the devil as you can possibly get with a character, and that's not just in his appearance but his entire sense of self. The Crimson King is a powerful immortal being whose characteristics mirror both the physical realm as well as the nature of the Prim being the darkness behind everything. Now, interestingly, he is believed to be the same species as Pennywise, some even going as far as to believe Pennywise is his son. I'm not buying this one though, because the Crimson King is a whole other level of evil. He is the controlling power behind some of Stephen King's most terrifying villains, including Mr. Munchin, Dandelo, and our previous number, Randall Flagg. Now, his history is convoluted, but simply put, he was the bastard offspring of Arthur Eld, a legendary gunslinger, and a demonic entity, the Crimson Queen. At some point, the Crimson King gained the hierarchy of the Red and had a plot to topple the Dark Tower and destroy the reality it holds so that he can rule in the primordial chaos. Yeah, this dude is evil incarnate with one goal: to bring misery and death to all. Coming in at 5, Cujo from Cujo. Published back in 1981, Cujo is a psychological horror about rabid Saint Bernard. Yeah, It's that simple. Dogs are supposed to be man's best friend, however this pooch is no one's friend. Now this number is all dependent on how you view the source material. The original text at face value is literally about the poor dog Cujo who goes crazy on account of rabies. Yeah, no fun at all. However, if you choose to side with the supernatural elements of the text, things change a little. Well, a lot. And you may be fearing the ghost of Killer Frank Dodd has possessed Cujo the dog. However, no matter how you spin it, Cujo is still terrifying because, to put it simply, King took something so innocent, something so full of love, and made it sinister and a killing machine, with Cujo wanting nothing more than to rip apart the mother and son trapped inside their car. It's simple, but that's what makes it truly terrifying, perhaps because so many of us have dogs or want dogs. The idea that the instinct to kill could take over our lovable furry friends is completely and utterly terrifying. Coming in at number 4, Gage Creed, Pet Sematary. Published back in 1983, Pet Sematary follows Louis Creed, a doctor from Chicago, who relocates with his family to a house near the small town of Ludlow, Maine, with his wife Rachel, their 2 young children Eileen and Gage, and Ellie's cat Winston Church. Louis quickly learns of the local cemetery where the children of the town bury their deceased animals. However, it isn't as wholesome as you would believe. The pets that are buried come back to life. And our characters learn this when Winston is hit by a truck and returns not long after being buried. However, he doesn't return the same. Nothing ever does. However, it isn't so much the supernatural elements of Pet Sematary that we're going to be focusing on here. No, it's the character of Gage Creed, the youngest child, and the scariest. Gage is one of the primary antagonists from the book and the film of the same name. Though starting out innocent and sweet, things take a turn when he is run over by a truck at Thanksgiving. However, Gage's death was actually caused by the magic of the Pet Sematary, a place where Gage is ultimately buried and in turn returns back to life. No longer a sweet and innocent child, but now a zombie that seeks to kill his family and his neighbours. There is something truly evil inside this tiny body of Gage, and it has a brutal lust for blood, even wielding a scalpel and wreaking havoc across his small town. Honestly, Gage still haunts my dreams. In at number 3, the Overlook Hotel from The Shining. Now, arguably the main antagonist in the 1980 horror movie The Shining is the Overlook Hotel, the haunting, mysterious and isolated hotel located deep in the Colorado mountains. It's the location of this psychological horror that houses Jack Torrance and his family over a long winter in hopes of curing his writer's block. All is well at first. Jack, his wife Wendy and their young son Danny settle in. That is, before Danny becomes plagued by psychic premonitions that gradually become more disturbing over the course of the movie. However, during this time, Jack begins to discover the hotel's dark and disturbing secrets, and begins to unravel into a homicidal maniac hell-bent on terrorizing his family. Now, in the world of Stephen King, hotels are a naturally creepy place, specifically in the short story 1408, which takes place in the Dolphin Hotel. However, the Overlook Hotel best exemplifies the true horror of what a hotel is capable of. The Overlook is festering with ghosts, and these ghosts are not kind at all. They're incredibly hostile and seek to lure you deeper into the hotel and into their grasps. They are demonic spirits trapped in eternal misery, forced to forever relive their gruesome ends, and in turn bringing harm to anyone who gets in their way. The Shining is scary, but the film would be absolutely nothing without the hotel. A place that no matter what makes you feel a constant unease and discomfort. A place that houses the undead who have nothing but evil intentions. In at 2, Henry Bowers from It.
Bowers! Mike! Mike! Where's he?
Published back in 1986, it is Stephen King's 22nd book and his 17th novel, with the story following the experience of 7 children as they are terrorized by an evil entity that exploits the fears and phobias of its victims to disguise itself while hunting its prey, Pennywise the Clown. However, this isn't the monster we're discussing today. No, it's Henry Bowers. Henry is the psychopathic school and neighborhood bully and the secondary antagonist in the novel. novel It, the miniseries, the 2017 film adaptation, and the 2019 sequel. Bowers is everywhere. He is also the leader of the Bowers Gang, a gang of preteen bullies who bully and rival the Losers Club. Now, Henry's childhood is somewhat tragic and may answer the question as to why he is the way he is. Raised in a poor, violent environment by his mentally ill, racist, and alcoholic father, Henry rapidly developed into a hateful boy who would often verbally and physically attack anyone around him. Now, Henry's erosion to insanity began prior to the summer of 1958, during which time he torments the losers with acts of violence, such as carving his name onto Ben Hanscom's belly, killing Mike Hanlon's dog with raw meat laced with insect poisoning, breaking Eddie's arm, and whitewashing Stan's face in the snow until it bleeds. Yeah, Henry Bowers is truly disturbed. Henry eventually comes to possess a switchblade, which he uses to kill his crazy abusive father. However, all of his disturbing behaviours come to a head when he chases the losers down through the sewers under Derry, where he encounters Pennywise, who takes the form of Frankenstein's monster, and kills Henry's friend Vic and Belch. Two murders that Henry would later be charged for before being committed to the Juniper Hill Asylum for life, up until he escapes in 1985. Henry is a character that terrifies me more than Pennywise itself, simply because he has no limits. He will hurt anything and anyone for no reason. He does it simply because he can. Even in the wake of a shape-shifting entity, his violence never ceases. And finally, coming in at number 1, Kurt Barlow from Salem's Lot. Published in 1975 before being made into a TV movie released in 1979, Salem's Lot is a horror novel by Stephen King and involves a writer named Ben Mears, who returns to the town of Jerusalem's Lot in Maine, where he lived from the age of 5 through 9, only to discover that the residents are becoming vampires. Now, Kurt Barlow is the main antagonist in this disturbing story, and is not just a vampire, but a master vampire who terrorizes this small Maine town. This is King's only foray into the world of vampires, the classic ones at least, and Barlow was King's way of getting the entire mythos right the first time, and he truly did it. Not only is it King's second novel and his first of many centering on preternatural creatures, but Salem's Lot was the first small town novel, a setting that King would return to many times. Now, Barlow arrives in Maine after he is shipped in a box by his human assistant, and the two take residence in the mansion, a mansion that is considered to be haunted by almost everyone in the town. Now, Stephen King kept this novel simple, well, at least simple in its setup. It's essentially a modern take on Dracula and weaves that classic tale into his small town setting. And in the process, he created one of the most terrifying and disturbing monsters in horror history, Kurt Barlow. Now, his age is unknown, but before the events of the novel, it is suggested that Barlow's original name or alias was Braken, and that he was an Austrian nobleman who has spent centuries satisfying his appetites for humans. Barlow is arguably more of a catalyst, using residents as pawns to tighten his grip on the town, with his very presence invoking a sense of dread. A quote from the novel reads that above all else they did not look out their windows, no matter what noises or dreadful possibilities, no matter how awful the unknown, there was an even worse thing, to look the Gorgon in the face. Yep, Kurt Barlow is not to be messed with.
Is off at number 5, 1408, 2007.
No, it's the prospect of something after death. How many spirits have you broken?
And while it may not be one of King's most memorable works, it is most definitely a demonstration of why his horror translates so well to the silver screen. King has the uncanny ability to literally breathe life into his characters, capturing their flawed sense of humanity. And the oftentimes underwhelming John Cusack actually delivers that incredibly well through his performance in 1408. Directed by Mikael Hafstrom and released in 2007, 1408 tells the tale of Mike Enslin, a cynical author and pseudo-paranormal investigator who takes up the task of staying in the most haunted room in the most haunted hotel in New York City after receiving an ominous message stating "Don't enter 1408. Well, yeah, we know how that goes, right? Given the fact that 90% of this film takes place in relatively the exact same setting, the plot is so damn intriguing and unnerving that we never really get the chance to take notice. Although it kind of went under the radar, 1408 received incredible praise for its uncanny handling of the paranormal, in what is essentially a cut and shut haunted house story. Of course, it's a Stephen King movie, and of course, it turns out to be so much more. Also, there's like 4 alternate endings for this film, and 3 of them are pretty damn harrowing. Next up at number 4, Misery, 1990.
Have you all got amnesia? They just cheated us. This isn't fair. He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car.
Not only did 1990's Misery deliver us one of King's most insanely terrifying characters, it also cemented itself as the only King adaptation to date to ever receive an Oscar, bagging Kathy Bates' performance the 1999 Academy Award for Best Actress in her role as a psychopathic Annie Wilkes. And if you've ever seen Misery, you'll know exactly why she deserves that award, because holy moly, she's incredibly convincing as a psychopathic sledgehammer-wielding #1 fan. In fact, the reason that Misery is so damn scary is because it cuts so close to the bone. It's real. People like Annie Wilkes exist, and that is so much more impactful than a demonic laundry press. Yeah, it goes without saying, really. Sorry to the Mangler. Directed by Rob Reiner with an adapted screenplay by William Goldman, Misery tells the story of Paul Sheldon, a famed novelist and author of a successful romance series featuring a character named Misery Chastain. Paul has a near fatal car accident when caught in a winter storm, and who saves him? None other than Annie Wilkes, who just so happens to be Paul Sheldon's #1 fan. And we know what happens next, don't we? I'll never look at a sledgehammer and a wooden block the same way again. Swinging in at number 3, Carrie, 1976.
Everyone in bed, Mama. Everything in the sin.
Come to your closet and pray. Ask to be forgiven.
He's a nice boy, Mom. You like him. You really like him, Mama.
I'm just going to come out and say it. Carrie is so good that it could qualify as many different things, not just a terrifying horror movie. The amount of themes that are crammed into this film, carried by Sissy Spacek's incredible performance, is oftentimes breathtaking, and the fact that Stephen King's wife, Tabitha, pulled this manuscript out of the trash after King himself had thrown it away is one of literature's greatest vindications, because not only did we get King's debut novel, we also got one of his most incredible silver screen adaptations. Directed by Brian De Palma, the film stars Sissy Spacek as Carrie White, the 17-year-old high school student who is frequently the butt of some awful practical jokes at the hands of her peers. Well, turns out Carrie has got some untapped telekinetic powers that's been hindered and kept at bay by her fanatically religious mother, Margaret White, played by the awesome Piper Laurie. There are so many iconic scenes in 1976's Carrie that it's sometimes hard to catch your breath, but that's exactly what King and later Brian De Palma intended. Start to finish, Carrie is the onslaught of a teenage girl who just about had enough of people telling her what to do. And it's awesome. Coming in at number 2, The Mist, 2007. I'm not going to lie, 2007's The Mist makes my number 2 spot for, well, 2 reasons. Frank Darabont and the ending of this film. It goes without saying, but Darabont is perhaps the only commercial director that has ever truly captured the essence of Stephen King's work, after being responsible for both 1994's The Shawshank Redemption and 1999's The Green Mile, which would have made this list if not for the fact that they're tearjerkers instead of horror movies. Yeah, I'll cry every time that John Coffey says he's afraid of the dark. Every damn time. Without shame. Directed by Frank Darabont with a screenplay adaptation from the man himself, The Mist, although a monster movie in truth, manages to perfectly encapsulate the horror of humanity, exploring the central themes of the lengths that ordinary people will go to under extraordinary, horrifying circumstances, as in a town full of terrifying, vicious, Lovecraftian monsters that are hidden behind a strange, unnatural mist. Also, Thomas Jane is so bloody good in this film, it's hard not to love it just for that fact. Also, side note, Thomas Jane is awesome in anything. The fact that the ending to this film shocked even Stephen King himself says so much about The Mist, and Darabont's interpretation takes the horror of small town living to a whole new level. And finally, at number 1 spot, The Shining, 1980.
I can't get out.
which may in actual fact be a bit of a controversial #1 pick, given the fact that Stephen King himself absolutely hated Stanley Kubrick's cinematic adaptation of his novel, so much so that King is still incredibly vocal about why he hates it so much to this day. It kind of pains me to Judas my man King like that, but this is all about the horror movies, and The Shining is an undeniable absolute masterpiece of cinematic history and a masterclass of building atmospheric dread on the silver screen. Written and directed by the legendary Stanley Kubrick, there's not much more that I could say about 1980's The Shining without giving it the credit that it deserves. Like, where do we even begin? Jack Nicholson's performance, which is perhaps the most terrifying on-screen depiction of the human mind descending into madness, the pure terror of a home in rapture captured on a knife's edge by the incredible Shelley Duvall. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Red Rum, the near heart attack inducing Grady twins, the elevator full of blood, the fact that this film is now such a cultural icon that is connected to a myriad of conspiracy theories, including Kubrick's fake moon landing, and I don't really know where to begin or end in regard to The Shining. It's horror cinema at its finest. End of story. Getting off at #5, Margaret White, Carrie.
And God made Eve from the rib of Adam, and Eve was weak and loosed the raven on the world. And the raven was called Sin. Say it.
Because although we also covered Mrs. Carmody from The Mist in our first video, no one does terrifying zealotry quite like Mrs. Margaret White, the mother of the titular Carrie, and a woman so entrenched in her own obsession with sin that in Stephen King's world, Carrie's own mother becomes her most horrifying adversary. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that although both novel and film versions of Mrs. White are equally scary, Piper Laurie's performance of Mrs. White in the 1976 cinematic adaptation added so much to the fear of a mother lost to madness that it's worthy of separating the two. Appearing in King's 1974 debut novel Carrie, Mrs. White is instrumental in forcing her telekinetic daughter into a life of misery and emotional abuse as Mrs. White battles with her own ideology of judgment and punishment inflicted on her after years and years of being in an abusive relationship. I'm not going to lie, the events of Carrie cover some pretty heavy themes, often personified by Mrs. White herself, but what King manages to perfectly capture in his debut novel is that despite the supernatural, despite the corporeal, sometimes the true meaning of fear is left waiting at home. Swinging in at #4, Kurt Barlow, Salem's Lot. For some of you, that scene in Tobe Hooper's 1979 TV miniseries may have been one of your more terrifying brushes with King's work, and that reaction alone, the body freezing in complete and utter moral horror at the sight of a Type 1 vampire in a prison cell, is exactly what we all want from a vampire movie, right? Right, because that's what Kurt Barlow is meant to represent, an all-consuming evil that humanity can only hope to hide from, or build up enough courage to stake him through the heart. From a personal perspective, Salem's Lot, written by King in 1975, was the first time that a horror novel ever made me actually terrified to turn the page, and it was because of the ever-encroaching dread of Kurt Barlow's character. Also, Ralphie Glick. It takes a while to get going, but during the events of the novel, Barlow arrived in the town of Jerusalem's Lot in a large sealed box by his familiar and assistant Richard Straker, posing as an antiques dealer while also kidnapping the local children of the town in a human sacrifice appeasement ritual for his vampire master. Although I think it's accepted to appreciate both the novel and 1979 miniseries versions of Barlow, in the show he took on a much more Nosferatu-esque appearance, resembling a horribly disfigured mutant-like creature with snarling teeth. Also, telekinesis, as if vampires aren't terrifying enough already. Thanks, Stephen King. Next up at #3, Donald Elbert, The Stand. And for those of you that have already seen the cheese-ridden pseudo-90s classic of a TV series, then this guy will be a bit of a curveball in your horror repertoire, to say the least. Donald Elbert, also known as the Trash Can Man, is somewhat of an enigma when it comes to horror fiction, because with this guy, King plays on one of our most exploitable emotions, empathy. The overarching themes that the Trash Can Man embodies are why King is so masterful in his horror fiction, because what we have in essence is a man who is so fanatical in his urge to burn things, who inevitably literally detonates a nuclear weapon and kills everyone and everything, yet we still feel sorry for this guy. Kind of. All throughout his life, Donald Elbert was at the beck and call of powers outside of his control, manifested and personified in his schizophrenic pyromania. As a child, Donald's father killed his eldest 3 children after getting into an argument at a bar and killing the bartender, although Donald's mother managed to flee the house with then 5-year-old Donnie. For the rest of his life, he would descend into an all-burning madness and social isolation, that is, until the events of The Stand, where he meets the all-evil man in black himself, Randall Flagg, and old Walter Old Dim realizes that his friend in need is a friend indeed to help him rule the wasteland. Donald Elbert is so damn scary as the Trash Man because he's a man that has literally nothing to lose, and he's a man that's willing to burn it all to the ground. Coming in at number 2, the Overlook Hotel, The Shining.
No charge, dear Mr. Torrance. No charge? Your money's no good here.
And I know that many of you guys wanted to see the Overlook Hotel make this list, and I'm more than happy to oblige because much like with Blaine the Mono, King has an uncanny knack for turning inanimate objects and structures into some terrifying horror villains in their own right. So much so that it's been referenced several times in King's work: Misery, the spiritual sequel Doctor Sleep, the Castle Rock TV series, and of course its crowning performance in the 1977 novel The Shining. As the events of the novel gradually allude to, the Overlook Hotel, a grandiose residence out in the Rocky Mountains, was actually the historical site of many ancient atrocities, including suicides, gangland murders, and a bizarre series of suspicious changes in ownership. Despite that though, the building managed to maintain its grand decor and sumptuous grounds, but of course there's a little more to it, and it's because the Overlook Hotel and the ghosts that inhabit it have become an entity in and of themselves, and as Jack Torrance finds out, it's ravenous for a fresh new soul. The machinations of the Overlook Hotel are later built on in King's 2013 sequel to The Shining, Doctor Sleep, and in some bizarre twist of fate, it kind of redeems itself. It's still terrifying though, and a stark warning to be careful of taking a caretaker job that seems too good to be true. Because it probably is, and it's a house full of ghosts. And finally, our number 1 spot, The Crimson King. And unfortunately, there isn't a cinematic clip to accompany this point because there is yet to be a worthy silver screen interpretation of perhaps King's most all-consuming and all-powerful evil entity, the Crimson King, and that's because it would kind of be impossible to correctly capture the shapeless form of the most powerful entity in King's multiverse. Also known as Lost the Red, Ram Abala, Lord of the Spiders, and the Kingfish, this guy is the puppet master and main antagonist of the Dark Tower series. Although the Man in Black comes a close second, he answers to this guy. We're in some pretty thematic territory here, but the Crimson King is only ever alluded to in King's fictional mythos as an ever-changing and shapeless entity, and his appearance is as the orchestrator of the chaos and decay that occurs in the Keystone world, and much of that in all the other worlds connected by the Dark Tower. His ultimate goal is to tear down the Dark Tower itself, bring about Discordia, which is essentially the scrambled egg version of existence, and then remake the universe in his own image. Although Randall Flagg is the big bad evil in many of King's fictional works, he does serve one guy, and it's this guy. The Crimson King, Leroy Roos, pretty much King Satan himself. If that doesn't get you, he's also a were-spider, so nah, I'm good thanks.
Coming in at number 5, we've got Pennywise Penitentiary. Pennywise is a recurring character throughout the Stephen King universe, whether he intended for that to be the case or not. All sorts of theories peg Pennywise as an omnipotent being who tortures people across timelines and stories. Some seem a little far-fetched, while others seem to think that the malevolent energy that shows up in many King stories is all connected. But try this one on for size. One of King's largely horrorless tales, The Shawshank Redemption, could actually be fueled by the killer clown himself. Consider the following. A great deal of the inmates at Shawshank claim to be innocent. Sure, it might be a bit of an overstatement, and honestly, probably a little bit of an inside joke among the old-timers, but what if it was true? We all know that Pennywise can influence people to commit all sorts of atrocious acts, things they wouldn't consider doing otherwise. We've seen this happen with Henry Bowers in Derry. Sure, he was a violent bully, but he wasn't about to go around murdering a bunch of folks, including his abusive father. So if Pennywise has demonstrated the ability to make one person act out of character and more murderous than usual, why wouldn't he be doing this all over the place? The folks who ended up at Shawshank may have actually committed the crimes they claim to be innocent of, but just can't remember doing so, taken over by the will of Pennywise to cause mayhem. Or maybe Pennywise took over somebody else and ended up framing the folks who ended up in the hoosegow. Either way, it's a fascinating theory and ties two of King's most famous works together, even though they're very tonally different. Should they rename the prison at this point? Coming in at number 4, we've got Maximum McQueen. I don't think you're ready for this one. I know I wasn't when I first read about it. Okay, deep breaths now. Disney's Cars universe and Maximum Overdrive take place in the same timeline. Lightning McQueen is a descendant of the insane, autonomous vehicles from the classic comedy horror. Think about it. Based on his short story Trucks, in which all the trucks on Earth suddenly gain sentience and start to enslave the human race under threat of screeching metal death, Maximum Overdrive doesn't paint a very hopeful picture. After a comet awakens something in every vehicle and electronic on Earth, folks have a tough time surviving. The biggest issue, surprise surprise, is the violence capable of being committed by all sorts of cars. Trucks, vans, sedans, hatchbacks, you name it. These things are heavy, fast, and hard to destroy without the use of another vehicle or a driver heading into a wall. If this were to continue for an extended period of time, humanity might be hurting big time. Without vehicles to keep the supply chain moving, folks wouldn't be able to live life comfortably, and with murderous cars patrolling outdoor spaces at all times, it's not likely folks would have a good run at starting fresh. If the ill effects of the comet stayed behind, humanity would probably go extinct. We're just not ready to reap what we've sown by insisting that every American own a personal vehicle. Oh, and that applies to real life too, unfortunately. I seriously doubt high-speed trains would ruin everything if they gained sentience, what with tracks and all. But back to the theory. Humanity driven extinct by vehicles. Vehicles retaining sentience. Cars creating their own society. Cars. Flash forward a few hundred years and we've got a flourishing vehicle civilization built on the grave of humanity. They drive around, fueling up, running businesses, becoming famous athletes. And that, folks, is how Maximum Overdrive led to Disney's Cars. Ka-chow. Coming in at number 3, we've got Ice is Not So Nice. Here's another wild one for you, and that has to do with Disney animation too. Get this, some folks claim that Frozen is an alternate universe reimagining of Kubrick's The Shining. Now I know that King doesn't really like what old Stanley did to his story of alcoholism and redemption, but The Shining is an outstanding film. The ending is a little different than what King imagined, but the frozen fate of Jack does make this theory possible. So let's take a look at some of the characters from Frozen. There's Elsa, the cold, isolated individual with a history of violent outbursts. And Anna, the young, innocent ingenue once damaged by the person they idolize. And Kristoff, a rescuer who makes his way through ice and snow to protect the innocent. Now think about The Shining. Jack, who heads off into the snowy mountains to write, becoming more unhinged over time. And Danny, the young, innocent ingenue, once damaged by the person they idolize. And Halloran, a person who finds a way to snowmobile out to the Overlook to help Danny, although he was much more helpful in the book, unfortunately. Taking place largely in the snow, having folks lose their minds, and featuring a hit musical number by Idina Menzel all ties these movies together. Okay, maybe that last one isn't true. Maybe this theory is silly and too far-fetched and relies heavily on some loose tropey character analysis, but it is too much fun not to talk about. Scream away about it down in the comments. Coming in number 2, Randall Flagg could be walking behind the rose. Oh me, oh my. There are plenty of theories concerning what is actually happening in the cornfields of Gatlin, Nebraska. Some say the field is afflicted by the same curse that keeps the tall grass inescapable, and others claim that the deadlights have something to do with it, possibly roping in Pennywise. But one that stands out above the rest is the idea that Randall Flagg could have taken his affinity for corn a little too far. The big bad in The Stand, who also appears throughout the Dark Tower series, really does love the all-natural source of sweeteners and ethanol. Is it too much to say that he would have no problem using this love to convince a bunch of wayward kids to perform sacrifices in a podunk town? He's got no problem killing people en masse, why not have a little fun with it? Poor Isaac and Malachi might not have been so bloodthirsty and unfortunate if they had just avoided corn worship altogether. Mr. Flagg couldn't let that happen though. But now we have to wonder if there really is a connection between the cornfields and the fields of tall grass. Less explicit demons there, more general insanity fueled by dark forces. And finally at number 1, they're all connected. You knew this was coming. Everyone's favorite Stephen King theory is that all of his stories are connected in some way. Is it even a theory at this point? Like, it was more or less confirmed by the Dark Tower, right? I suppose that's on the literary side of things where it's like explicitly confirmed. Places like Castle Rock and Derry show up all over the place throughout both literature and cinema, and lots of characters and events seem to cross over. It all seems to center around Maine, which makes sense because that's where King was born. But then there are the cross-dimensional bits that seem to exist in a multiverse equivalent to Maine somehow. The Dark Tower, both in writing and on screen, is the major link between worlds here. It introduces the ideas of thinnies, places where reality is a little thinner than usual, allowing things to slip between worlds. That's how we get stuff like the creatures from the mist in our world, and it's also likely how Pennywise gets around a lot of the time. Plus, there are countless non-supernatural connections between characters. People from different King stories grew up next to each other, or have cousins that know cousins, or children that show up at schools or in marketplaces and so on and so forth. It's hard to say whether King intended for all this to be the case from the start, but as time goes on, folks discover more and more connections. Pretty wild, right?